2016, this came out on Twitter, and it's a photo of 6 oranges wrapped in plastic at Whole Foods sitting there on the shelf. And as you can imagine, this kind of went viral, and the tweet that goes with it: if only nature would find a way to cover these oranges so we didn't need to waste so much plastic on them. Interestingly enough, some discussion ensues, as you might expect, and people with different disabilities kind of pipe up and say, hey, these oranges are actually really useful to me in this form because I can't peel an orange. I have really severe arthritis. I can't peel this orange. So the fact that it's in that container is like a fantastic thing for me. And ultimately, the discussion kind of keeps going. And finally, one person with a disability actually kind of comes back into the conversation after everybody's been talking about the accessibility angle. And she comes back in with her disability, and she says, yeah, accessibility is great and all, but you know that wasn't the idea behind this product in the first place. It wasn't designed for people with disabilities. This is an example of what I like to think of as something being accidentally accessible, right? It can happen, but it wasn't done on purpose. This is really a thing where this is a happy byproduct of some other thing that happened, and we get to the point where it still ends up being accessible, but we don't ever necessarily think about it. We don't know why. We haven't analyzed it to see what went well, what we could have improved for next time. So that's the kind of thing that we see very often. So accessibility can happen by accident, but what I would love for you to be doing is to really make it an intentional thing. This is something that takes time, it takes effort, it takes care to include people, and Alistair just kind of gave a whole bunch of different examples and reasoning for that. I am thankful because that shortcuts some of the things so that you're already well primed for this. I'd like to share with you a story about this man. This is Henry Butler, and Henry is a jazz pianist. He is an incredible musician. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago. But he was part of a performance that I went to that was called Sight, Sound, Soul. And Henry, in addition to being a wonderful musician, happened to be blind. And so he learned music at a very young age and had to work very hard at it. And I want to share some of this performance with you. I was at a specific accessibility conference, and we ended up getting to the point where after the event, we went to this building that was almost like an old barn. And lots of people there you can see, and I don't know how well you can see it in the audience, but there are many people in wheelchairs and on scooters and people with different disabilities in the audience. Everybody is all together. And they set this up to be an inclusive and an accessible arts, performing arts event. So you can see here, there's Henry, and he's sitting with his back to the audience, and you can see his piano there as well. Right beside Henry to the left is the ASL Interpreter. Right beside, and you can see just above the ASL Interpreter, you can see a 3-line caption display. To the left in the photo, there's actually the captioner, the person that is going to do the live captioning. And then beside that person is a person that is going to do audio description. So I want to share some of this performance with you. It's really, it's interesting. I will stop it at certain points, and then we'll unpack it a little bit. So get ready for some jazz music. Some jazz music. Some jazz music. Oh my gosh, it went way too fast. Hang on. Oh no. You can't see what I can see on the screen, and what I see on the screen is not good. Does anybody else use a Mac? Hands up and say aye if you use a Mac. Yeah, I've got a little thing here we call that a beach ball. Let's see if this works. Oh my gosh. We're gonna do this. This is gonna be worth it. It's gonna be right back. So, Henry, brilliant musician. They're gonna go through, you'll see the performance in a minute. He plays, in the first piece is an instrumental piece. Really? Beach ball? We just finished talking about how I always used to like to use my own equipment because I know that it's reliable and going to work, and then this happens. So we're almost back. Hang on one second. I'm just going to add this on to the end of my time, right? I can't do that. 1 second. 1 more second.
We're cutting the video so no one will ever know that it happened. It'll be sewn together so perfectly that this never happened.
Perfect. Excellent. Of course, now all kinds of apps are going to start up. Yes.
Is your video on YouTube?
It is not. Why would we do that? These are like my own personal videos, so no, we can't get them on YouTube, unfortunately. We're almost there. This will work. So I feel the lights like really hot right now. Okay, just pretend none of that ever happened. So, to Henry. Now I'm going to stop it there. There's a lot to unpack in here, and the first thing that blew my mind when I was at this performance was the fact that there's an ASL interpreter that is incredibly active in an instrumental piece of music. And that for me was like, what is happening? Like, I did not expect that at all. This audience is filled with people with all kinds of different disabilities, and the whole point of this is that this is an arts performance. So we get to the point where she is like digging right in and doing the interpretation of the music, and you can see in the caption, if you saw the scrolling caption display, you would see the musical notes flying by. Did you notice things that she did where she started out like it was not really all that in sync with the piano playing, but then as she started to hear the piece of music, she started to actually do things like in the same time that Henry was playing. She was actually becoming part of the performance herself. Did you see a spot where she showed that Henry was kind of tapping his foot? I don't know if you saw that, but she taps her hand, like showing that that's what Henry is doing. This is the next person here is Celia, who does some audio description. So she's going to describe what she just saw. That she's going to describe the performance. Now, this audio description is there for somebody that cannot see everything that is happening. The ASL interpretation is there for somebody that can't hear it. The captioning is also there for somebody that can't hear it. So let's listen to Celia. Let me make sure of one thing here. Oh, this is disappointing. There should be sound there. Good thing we've got captioning. So I'm going to read this out because it seems like we're just all staring at the screen here. 2 8-foot paint-splattered plywood boards lean against the wall behind the baby grand piano on the right. 6 sheets of white paper are attached to the boards. Carol has 2 blonde braids tied with a pink bandana. She wears a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and blue plastic gloves. Surrounding the boards are buckets filled with brushes and trays and numerous bottles of paint. Sharon, the interpreter, has a black and white scarf tied around her waist, and she moves her body to the music, and her fingers play her invisible keys. The large room is cooled by whirling ceiling fans, while the audience members tap in time to the music. The audience spontaneously, and I wish you could hear it, but the audience spontaneously erupted into applause for the audio description. That audio description became a part of the performance art itself. Now, it gets better, and there's more to it.
Henry wears a royal blue suit jacket with satin embossing. He has a lavender shirt and burgundy slacks. His left foot pounds the rhythm as his fingers fly across the piano keys. 2 8-foot paint-splattered plywood boards lean against the wall behind the baby grand piano on the right. 6 sheets of white paper are attached to the boards. Carol has 2 blonde braids tied with a pink bandana. She wears a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and blue plastic gloves. Surrounding the boards are buckets filled with brushes and trays and numerous bottles of paint. Sharon, the interpreter, has a black and white scarf tied around her waist as she moves her body to the music and her fingers playing her invisible keys. The large room is cooled by whirling ceiling fans while the audience members tap in time to the music.
This next piece I wrote.
Okay, we need to stop that now. So we get to a point where ultimately what they are creating is this performance art piece together. And everybody is playing a vital piece, including Carol. And what she is doing here, she is actually painting a painting. Can you do that? She's painting a picture of Henry as part of the performance. And she gets to the point where she is actually painting in time with the music. And ultimately, we end up in a place where, as Henry kind of says and sings the last notes, Carol finishes the painting, and you can see one of the themes that came up over and over and over again was Henry is pounding his feet in time to the music. The audio describer talked about that. The ASL interpreter was showing that, and that's actually reflected in the painting itself. I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look at underneath the baby grand piano, you can see Henry's leg in multiple there are multiple instances of it, and she is showing that to show the motion. This ends up being a painting that is then sold and auctioned off for a local charity, and it's probably the most inclusive and accessible performance arts event that I've ever been to, and it gives me goosebumps thinking about it because it was an incredibly inclusive experience. The intentionality that goes into it to make this an accessible event was absolutely top-notch. I don't know all the details that went into it, but I know that they have been putting this event on for probably about 8 years. And so their understanding of what people in the audience need is really based on many years of doing this, and so they understand what those needs are and how best to meet those needs. The fact that they've incorporated a painting as a way of visualizing that performance for people that maybe can't hear the music is an incredible piece of this to me. So ultimately, we want everybody to start thinking this way, that accessibility is an outcome and inclusive design is a process that leads us there. For those of you that were in my workshop this morning, we talked about this a little bit, and ultimately, that was an accessible event. Okay? It was wonderfully accessible. How they got there, they could have got there in many different ways. We saw the oranges that were accessible at the beginning. Those were accessible, but that was by accident. It was not done intentionally. So we want to think about this as a process that we can use. Inclusive design is a process that we use to get to that outcome of accessibility. So if we're looking at what accessibility is, it's the ability to be accessed or readily used by people with disabilities. If we look at what inclusive design is, this is a way that we measure how good of a job we're doing. But if we look at inclusive design, it's this intentional facilitation and crafting of all the interactions within an ecosystem that incorporate inclusion as a core value. The thing that is most important in here to me is this concept of core value. When we say that inclusion is a core value in this process, then we don't let it get pushed aside. That becomes the thing that holds it all together. You may have also heard of universal design. Universal design tends to be a process that we use to achieve accessibility, but it also means that we value creating one thing that will work for as many people as possible. So that idea of universality becomes the core value, if that makes sense to you, yeah? So that universality is the core value, that we have one solution that works for everyone. With inclusive design, inclusion is the core value. So maybe we have more than one solution in order to include as many people as possible, right? So this idea of a core value is probably, to me, one of the most important things. When I talk with teams, I hear stuff like this all the time. They say, we aren't excluding people intentionally. And I am usually very quick to point out and say, yes, but you aren't including them intentionally either. And this is really where we want to go with things. I want to share a couple of examples with you about the practice of inclusive design. And one of the reasons that we practice inclusive design is that it helps put us ahead of the curve. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. Ultimately, there are standards for accessibility, and the fact that they're standards is definitely confusing to some people. But if we think about this, we have practiced inclusive design for many years by including people with disabilities as part of the usability testing that we do to validate the designs and the solutions that we've created. But one of the things that we have seen over time is that, excuse me, is that things that we would find in usability testing were not included in the guidelines. So you may have heard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, put out by the W3C, the Web Accessibility Initiative. So we would find things in usability testing that weren't represented in the guidelines that people had to point to. And so we've done these usability tests or these usability sessions, and we see these things happen, and we've learned stuff from it. One of the things that we have learned is we find accessibility issues that aren't in those guidelines, and those are things that the industry tends to see as, well, it's not in the guidelines, therefore it's a nice to have. Right? It's not a thing that we can point to and specifically say, well, that's not in there, it's not in the list, so we're not going to do it. Things that we find in usability testing today might seem to be things that are nice to have, but in the future, they actually may become part of the standard. The nature of accessibility is that it is constantly changing as we invent new technologies, invent new access technologies, new assistive technologies, and we have new ways of knowing and understanding what accessibility actually means. So we get to a point where the things that we find today are going to be tomorrow's future standard. I want to share an example with you. This is a set of radio buttons, a custom set of radio buttons for an airline that we were working with. And you can see the radio buttons in the center of each kind of block. So the person did a search, they found several flights, they have lots of options for different classes of fares. And one of the things that we found when we did usability testing was, hey, these radio buttons, they're custom designed and they're rather low contrast. So it's a light gray on a white background. And that was difficult for people to see. Not just people with low vision, but people with generally perfect vision. It was difficult to see those radio buttons. And we knew this because many people people with low vision were looking at this and didn't know what actions to take because they couldn't see the radio buttons. They just thought it was a big grid of pricing. They didn't recognize, oh, this is a thing that I can actually interact with. And so we saw that behavior and we put it in our findings. These radio buttons are not high enough contrast, right? We got pushback. People pushed back and said, hey, that doesn't make sense. That's not in the checklist. We said, that doesn't mean that it's not an accessibility issue. And they said, yes, it does, because it's not in the checklist. Well, now, as of June 5th, 2018, it's in the checklist. Text, color contrast used to only apply to things that were text, right? Now it applies to things that are non-text. So 1.4.11, non-text contrast, this is now a thing that we can point to, and we've been pointing to it for about 6 years now. But people didn't want to believe that it was an accessibility issue because it wasn't in the checklist. So I'm going to say this. These radio buttons weren't accessible before June 5th and then inaccessible after, right? They were always inaccessible. We just didn't have a good rule to point to say this right here. And people rely on those rules. So when we practice inclusive design and incorporate people with disabilities and include them in our process, we actually get all kinds of intel and good insights onto what is and is not accessible before it ever makes its way into that checklist and into a future standard. So I hope that makes sense to you. There's other pieces as well. There's another piece of we did some usability testing on this card interface. If I'm using Dragon NaturallySpeaking and I'm looking at this interface, so I'm using Dragon, it's voice recognition software, and I've got, say, no use or limited use of my hands or really painful carpal tunnel syndrome or arthritis. If I look at this and I want to use the call to action, I'm going to say click flip, and that will allow me to flip over that card. We also know that people that use screen readers, if we have 4 links on there that say flip, 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 and flip, it's not going to be enough for them to understand what they're getting on the other side of that link. So the people that built this interface were really smart. They knew that that was not good. And so what they did was they basically said the link underneath where it says flip, the actual link text that was read out to a screen reader would say details for car 1, details for car 2, details for car 3, details for car 4. Those 4 links all made sense now to somebody that was consuming that page with a screen reader. But because the text was changed, when the voice recognition user that's using Dragon Naturally Speaking says click flip, it doesn't flip anymore. So now we have a new rule, and we saw this in usability testing, and we called it out, and they actually made the changes right away. We now have a new rule, WCAG 2.1, 2.5.3. The visual label of something must be in its accessible name, the thing that is underneath the hood that people will use to activate it. We found these things long before June 5th, 2018, long before they made it into drafts, and those are things that are now in the standard. I'm a big believer that when we include people with disabilities, we get way ahead of the game and we become much more efficient and we create better designs for everyone. So to kind of bring all of this together, I'd like you to be thinking about this. We often talk about doing something for, we want to design for people with disabilities. And I would like for us to not design for people with disabilities. I would like us to design with people with disabilities. Let's include people with disabilities in the process itself. And that doesn't just mean at the end when we are evaluating how well we did with that solution. I loved Alistair's use of the word power. Because when we design and do everything and incorporate people with disabilities only at the end, they have not co-designed, they have not participated, they are passive recipients of what we think is worthy. We have decided this, and they don't get a choice. They don't get a say. They don't get to participate. So I'd like you to think about what that actually means, what the difference is between designing with people with disabilities versus designing for people with disabilities. Michael Masutha in the early 1990s, he's a South African gentleman, and he had a disability himself. And he was one of the 2 people that kind of coined this phrase around the same time. Nothing about us without us. And that really frames everything that we want to be thinking about in terms of how we actually design with people with disabilities instead of for. I hope all of that makes sense. Think back to every situation that you're in terms of your design. How can you incorporate and include more people with disabilities into your work? Think of that performance art at the beginning and the inclusion that happened there through talking with and incorporating people with different disabilities right up front into the process. How do we should talk with people that are deaf. How do you enjoy music? Tell us more about what your experience with music is. For people that are blind, what do you like most about music? And we find out those things. We use that as exploration to actually help us decide what the solution should be, not a solution that we decide should be there, and then we test it with people at the end. So I hope that all makes sense to you. I'm absolutely happy to have questions and hopefully to give you some answers as well. I don't think I have a lot more time. So any questions from anybody? Somebody has one. I know there's got to be at least one out there. Is there one? I see one up at the back, and then we'll come down here.
Yeah, do you think sort of the rise of voice interfaces is going to affect how people sort of look at accessibility? Do you think there's going to be an effect there?
So do I think there will be an interesting effect on with the rise of voice interfaces, an interesting effect on accessibility overall? Absolutely, it's already happening. There's interesting things that are happening with voice assistants. I think it's bringing more awareness to things, and I think some people don't necessarily think of it as, like I think of it as a piece of assistive technology itself right now because it does things in the house. I don't have to get up to shut my lights off. I can just ask Alexa to turn my lights off, right? So I think it's bringing more awareness, and that whole voice interface is a useful trend to raise awareness for sure. If there's other questions that you have about that, or if I totally avoided answering your question there, I'm okay with that, and we can talk about it later. Was that okay, or?
Yeah, let's chat later.
Yeah, lots of ideas, but absolutely. There was another question over here somewhere. Yeah.
I thought the example with the cards was interesting, with the card detail, because you could argue why you should hide those details in the first place.
Yeah.
Just another thing to think about.
Yeah, so the card interface, like why would we hide things in the first place? This also happened in 2000 and I think it was around 2011 maybe. And so those card flippy interfaces were like, that was the thing. Like, we've got to have a card and have it flip, right? That's how we can hide, like that was basically like a flash in the pan. Like carousels have been playing the long game on that, right? The flip card is the exact same thing. How can we get more content on there, but hide it so that everybody gets, you know, a small amount of space, but has a lot of content. So same kind of idea. I agree with you, absolutely. Although I'm not one to judge people's designs. Oh wait, yes I do. I agree with you. It probably isn't a great design in the first place, but we're always kind of like, how do we make this design that has already been signed off on as accessible as it can be? There's a huge political cost to getting an already signed off design changed. And so in many cases, we're like, let's do the best that we can with this thing and make it better. But I agree with your point, absolutely. Anyone else? Yeah.
Are there any instances where designing for different disability means that you end up sort of conflicting?
Yes.
And how do you get over that?
I'm not prepared to tell you that today. No, I'm kidding. No, so there are many ways in which when we design and solve problems for like to make things work better for certain people with disabilities or for certain disabilities, that absolutely, in many cases, it makes it better for everyone. There are cases, and we were actually just talking about this not long ago, on the cognitive side and on the kind of the neurodiversity side, particularly when we're talking about people, like many people think, oh, that person has autism, they're probably exactly the same as this other person that has autism that I know. The reality is any two people with autism or any two people with any disabilities, just because they have the same disability doesn't mean that they're anything alike each other. They may have some common things, but certainly not. So one of the things in the cognitive and neurodiversity space is that we often have to build and design things for customization. So building for that customization allows people to kind of take control of that interface a little bit. Whereas if we made everything in the interface like that, it would definitely conflict with other people's needs. So as an example, somebody that has autism and maybe has difficulty with linguistic processing, like processing of language and literacy, they might have an extension in their browser that allows them to collapse all the content and only show the headings so that they can just click on a heading and just expand one little section at a time so they're not dealing with as much content, so they're not as overwhelmed. We wouldn't want to do that for everybody because we would then be making everybody expand each section to read it. So while that expanding each section section by section is really good for that person, it's not good for everybody else. So one of the core tenets is let's build things so that they are customizable and personalizable, so that we have that flexibility built in inherently into the things that we're creating. Anyone? They haven't pulled me off stage yet, so.
All right, I'm pulling you off stage. Come on, let's go.
He's going to pull me off stage. Okay.
Please put your hands together for Derek.
Thank you.